probably open and do roll call first. Would you think? Let's do that. So, because this is technically an open meeting, city council and planning and zoning, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So let's, as we open the meeting, let's go ahead and do roll call. Now, I think Debbie is in her office, Debbie Rosen. But let's do, and I'm not sure if she's on.
I am.
You are. Debbie, do you want to do roll call for city council?
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you.
Rodriguez? I thought I seen him on.
Oh.
Um,
Well, they were trying to put you in the corners, what they said earlier.
we'll look, Debbie, and then you can go ahead.
Okay.
Going through.
Werner?
Here.
Mucci?
Here.
Levi?
She's here.
She is.
Hammerfield?
Here.
And Bauer?
We don't see him. Okay, so we do have a quorum for city council. Perfect. And then do we want to do roll call for planning and zoning? Debbie, thank you.
Yes. Okay, so Tom?
Here.
Ron? Brett? Matt?
Here. Here.
Adam?
Here.
Steve?
Here.
Michelle?
Here.
Jeff?
Here.
Okay, and we have a quorum for planning and zoning.
Perfect. Well, as we start today, I just want to, first of all, say thank you to staff. The videos that you did, personally, I found them very helpful. It was a great way, and I have to say, as we all, we're tired of hearing the word COVID, but out of, and I'm sorry, I just noticed a text come through. Victor Rodriguez is working on trying to get on. He's just a little stuck with his computer, so he will be joining us. So that said, one of the good things that came out of this last year is technology. And I don't know in the past if we would have thought of doing what you did as staff, which was, I love the way you could either watch it as a whole or you could do it in bite-sized pieces. Excellent, excellent job. I really appreciated that, and I think it was a great idea to move us forward. This was a heavy lift, and I have to say thank you for working on it, the language changes, right? The cleaning up, where we had duplication, you've reduced it, and consolidated things, and then moving us towards the one thing that I heard a lot of, more density. So one question that I have in my mind, and you guys did such a phenomenal job, are there any unintended consequences from the decisions that we're making, right, that we haven't thought of? Is there an outcome that is possibly unintended, especially when we're looking at density? What can be the quote backlash from that? Is there something that we've missed? And so it's just a question that was in the back of my mind. And I don't have the answer to that one at all. But I want to just start and kick off our meeting today saying a huge thank you to staff. Great way to go through it. You've done a really good job. The other thing I want to share just very quickly is thank you to planning and zoning and to city council. I have greatly valued the times that we have come together. Rodney, thank you for bringing us together, because it's us working together as a team. And I think these opportunities to communicate and all get on the same page are so valuable. And for planning and zoning, as a volunteer, it's a heavy lift that you do each week in this incredibly busy season in the history of our community. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your work, because it truly is volunteer. And it's a lot of work for volunteers. And so I want to let you know how much I appreciate you. And then the city council. and their work and their commitment to our community. One thing that, a goal that I have had in the planning and zoning area, but in every decision our city council has to make, but today we're talking about planning and zoning issues, and that is that we provide good information, because you make decisions with the best information that you have at a given time, right? And so the goal of staff is to ensure that both planning and zoning and city council have the best information you can have to make the appropriate decision. And I feel like I love our presentations, and I feel like planning and zoning staff is doing a really good job in putting their presentations together. Just know, because Rodney and I connect, and we have a great staff. If there are suggestions for additions that we need to do as we move forward, please let them know, because they're open to those. If there's a suggestion, if we're missing something, because we want to make good decisions. This season of growth is really tough. When you've got House Bill 389 and the amazing growth we have going, it's really a challenging season, because there gets to be a little bit of conflict when it's too much. And if it is too much, how do you resolve it? What do you do? And you guys have heard me say highest and best use. To me, that is the standard in every decision we make. How do we obtain the highest and best use of the limited resource of land that we have? So all of that said, I'm going to be quiet the rest of the time, hopefully, and follow the lead of staff today. And thank you again for your hard work. It's appreciated. And here we go.
Thank you, Mayor. Really appreciated that. Just a quick response to the unintended consequences of what decisions we make here. Unfortunately, I'd say yes, there are going to be unintended consequences, but we've done our best to get a lot of open communication through this process so that we try to identify those up front. But if it happens that we adopt this code and we find that there are unintended consequences, we've established a protocol, that we want open communication between these two groups, and we will address those. If we find those, we'll address them again, and we'll continue to have these quarterly meetings with each other, or at least every 6 months, but I think we decided quarterly. So I look forward to doing that, and we will just keep working on it and respond to the market as it changes, and the culture as it changes too. So, all right.
Rodney?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Doug Critchfield. I also, Mary, you mentioned density, and I just want to clarify it for everybody about, in general, what we're talking about in these code changes. We're not proposing that a standard subdivision increase its density. What we're doing is we're asking for a standard subdivision to have some flexibility and provide open space that we haven't asked for before. And we're providing a mechanism to be able to do that without having to sacrifice the number of units or lots that could go into a subdivision. Where we are increasing the density is within a planned unit development or in a master plan community, where the density could increase by 20%. But as a result of that, there's higher guidelines and standards in terms of open space and landscaping and other factors in the development of that community, which is expected in that type of development. So I just want to clarify that for the group so that you understand when we talk about density what we're referring to.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to walk through one of the documents that I provided you yesterday. And this should be a pretty good summary of what we're going to talk about. You can look back on and refer back to it to see what changes we proposed. So just a quick note, I put this in a footnote, or the footing on each of the pages. The staff comments are going to be in green. Previously proposed changes to the code are in blue and underlined. And then new proposed changes today that were not proposed at our last workshop or in the videos that we sent out, that's in purple and underlined. So anytime you see that, you should be able to recognize what we're proposing here. So I'm just going to go through these in general, some comments that we received at the workshop that we didn't give an answer to. And then we'll go through the questions or comments that we received from each of the commissioners and the council members regarding the videos that we sent out. And then we will go into specifics of the chapters that we're proposing additional changes. There's just a few there. So I'd like to start with a comment that was made by our city engineer. He had a concern that the maximum lot sizes we proposed may not be possible for lots in cul-de-sacs, where lots are typically a lot larger than the rest of the properties in that subdivision. So we ran some comparisons to see if this would be a concern. And while some RS6 lots in the cul-de-sacs are certainly large, it is clear that adjustments to the lot layout and or the specific zone that they're in will allow these lots to not exceed the maximum lot size. There's still quite a bit of leeway on how large a property can be, as Doug has described. So for instance, an RS 8.5 zone would allow you to get a lot as large as 12,000 square feet. And in addition, we propose removing the street frontage requirement in the RS zone. The property will still need legal access, but this change allows developers to be more creative in lot placement and size at the end of the street. So I think we mentioned they could do hammerheads and private drives and that kind of thing, because we no longer require street frontage as long as there's access, legal access. Okay, the next question we got was what do we do to spread out? Specifically, we're concerned about traffic along specific corridors or a centralized location. Some of the problems related to traffic come from years and years of land use decisions where commercial is centrally located and residential has been placed long distances from those commercial corridors. The proposed master plan communities and mixed use developments and PUDs will help reduce travel distances and provide greater pedestrian and bicycle connectivity rather than forcing all trips taken to go via car. Part of the reason we don't see many situations where commercial or office are in the same building as residential is also because of the taxing structure. Commercial tax rates are applied to the entire building rather than taxing the residential floor area as residential and the commercial floor area as commercial. This discourages mixed use in a single building, and we propose working with the state and the county to see if an alternative approach to that taxing system is possible. And finally, we propose modifying the comp plan's future land use map to, zoom down here a little bit, to provide more commercial opportunities near residential. This will require a public outreach process involving citizens and developers to determine what commercial uses would be appropriate and where. Now, I wanted to address a couple of things here in addition to the comp plan and the future mixed use development. Multifamily residential can be may be constructed in the BC and the BN zones with a CUP. And so when we review Chapter 3 in just a few minutes, we will go over some changes we are proposing to require some commercial be developed as a part of the multifamily residential development. Again, we'll review those in a little bit here. And then last, land use and transportation are intricately connected. I've said that for years. You can't have you can't address one without it impacting the other. So we propose doing corridor studies with Public Works to identify appropriate land use changes along key corridors and identify methods to improve traffic. They're so connected that we have to think of them collectively. We have proposed a corridor study next year for Midland Boulevard, and that is the first step towards identifying land use changes and changes to the roadway at the same time to improve that traffic concern. And please stop me if you feel like I haven't addressed your concern or question that you had. Please stop me at any time. Okay, so the next comment, someone asked whether we could work with developers to create a pilot for doing a mixed use or a PUD development or master plan community to show others that it could work. And we have worked closely with a number of developers to draft the proposed code changes that we've submitted to you. These changes will make mixed use development and master plan communities more feasible for developers to do. To truly lead the process of creating a pilot, the city may need to invest in a project. The most common approach is for the city to purchase land and then use an RFP process to select a developer who would develop the property according to the stated goals of the city. So we may say, we would like a master planned community or maybe just a PUD where it's mixed use in a certain location. One thing that other communities have done is they purchase that land and then they do an RFP process and ask for submittals to say, how will you develop this out? And then eventually we turn that land over to that property owner or to the developer, and they develop that property according to that approved plan. So that's a possibility. If we really want to do a pilot, we could do that, but we are working closely with developers to just identify how we might encourage mixed use. And we are seeing interest. First time really ever in the last few years, we've seen more interest in mixed use than I've ever seen the entire time I've worked for the city. We also proposed creating area-specific plans to set detailed expectations for what land uses and development standards the city of Nampa would support in key areas in the community. An example of that is the 4 square mile that Meridian is doing. They identified specific types of land uses in specific layouts of that 4 square mile. And they even had a theme for what type of land uses could go there. It was agriculturally based. If we do that for our city, we need to identify specific areas, identify what we'd like to see there so that the developers can come in and say, okay, the city, this is what they want. We don't have to guess anymore what the city wants. We can see their plan says this type of land use. And if they develop according to that plan, it's a simple process because we've already gone through the process of identifying what needs to be there. And then finally, we will continue to review how other communities are accomplishing master plan communities and PUDs and report back to city leadership as we've done. I'm sorry, I didn't scroll down far enough for you to see all those comments. Okay, the last question here is, could we change the sidewalk width from 7 to 6 feet and 8 foot if double loaded? And this was the last comment that we took note of in the workshop that we weren't able to answer. And so we have proposed this. Basically what this is saying is we currently have a wheel stop required in parking stalls. And that wheel stop is required when the parking abuts a sidewalk so that you're not overhanging the sidewalk and making the sidewalk not usable at all. So what we have proposed in these code changes was to expand that to 7 feet so that if you had 2 feet or so of a truck sticking over the sidewalk, you still have 5 foot of sidewalk to walk down. The comment in the council and commission workshop was ADA standards are 4 feet. So could we just go to 6 feet so that we leave that 4 feet? And the only, absolutely, and we've proposed that change in the code based on that comment in the workshop. The only thing I'd say with that is it may not be may not meet the desire or the kind of the goals of the comprehensive plan to meet the minimum standard for sidewalks. And if council and commission wants to have the minimum standard of 4 feet for ADA sidewalks, we can go to 6 feet, and that's what's proposed. When it's double loaded, meaning parking on both sides of the sidewalk, they would need to go to 8 feet so that you'd still have that 4 feet minimum. Again, that's an open comment here, and I'd appreciate any feedback you can give us about that. If we want to go to 6 feet and 8 feet, that is what we have in the code now, or that's what we've proposed in the code. I'm going to take a minute and just give anybody a chance to speak to that.
Hey, Rodney, this is Mayor Debbie. Could you scroll your screen down just a hair to look at your full
sorry.
staff? I know it's so hard to remember that, but thank you so much. Thank you.
So Rodney, this is Randy Haverfield. Just going back over what you just said, I'm sorry I was diverted looking at something else on my desk, but so are you looking at a 6-foot sidewalk and an 8-foot sidewalk for what purposes again?
So-
6 foot would meet ADA requirements. What's the 8 foot for?
So it's when it's double parked. So if you have
So you
parking
still
on both
maintain a
sides.
4-foot length? Yeah, the walkway at 4 feet is what I tried to point out is at our meeting. So, so that makes perfect sense to me. Meets the ADA, standards, which is an acceptable standard in the industry. So, and it's not a waste of concrete, which is cost associated to a project. So, I'm okay.
All right, we'll move on. Okay, so then we sent out the videos, and here are the comments we received back from, or questions. Some of the comments were just comments and weren't necessarily something we needed to respond to. So if you have any comments that you felt like needed to be responded to and we didn't, please speak up. But the first one were from Councilman Haverfield. And the question is, the off-street parking required to be placed in a way that can be covered in the future. Staff actually we proposed removing the requirement for covered parking in all but the RS zones. So no requirement for covered parking unless you're in an RS zone, RS6, RS4, RS7, all those. And then the next question was, does this mean that a 20-foot driveway in front of a garage does not qualify as the second parking space for an apartment unit? There's no requirement that parking for an apartment unit be covered. The driveway could accommodate parking for an apartment if it is wide or long enough. And apartments put in covered parking all the time, but that's just their decision. And then finally, will ADA parking spaces also have the same requirement? No covering is required for ADA spaces. Commissioner Turner's question was on Chapter 22. I think if someone proposed a parking lot that is planned to be a permanent one, it needs to be paved before anyone can start using it. Let's see. So there are basically three exceptions to the requirement already in our code that state it needs to be paved or surfaced, we call it. There's only three exceptions. The first one, of course, is a secondary residential driveway. So that could be a gravel driveway. It would need to be something that would not stir up dust or anything. It can't just be dirt. It needs to be a hard surface of some kind, meaning gravel or pavers or something like that. And then the next exception would be a commercial or industrial lot specifically exempted by city council temporarily. It can't be a permanent exemption from the code, but it could be temporarily for maybe weather reasons, or in the case of the downtown, there's a lot that was exempted temporarily just because nothing was being done on it for a long period of time. We couldn't get anything to develop on it, and so it was exempted temporarily. But we put that as a condition that they get approval from city council to do that. And then third, parking lots screened from view and specifically meant for large vehicle parking or traversing over that. So we don't look over the fence to see if something's paved, if it's screened from view. If it's completely screened, we don't require that parking lot to be paved. And so those are the three exemptions. I felt like this question needed some discussion from the commission and the council. If we should do exactly as Commissioner Turner has commented and pave everything, all parking lots. So, any comments?
Hey, Rodney, this is Tom Turner.
Yes.
Yeah, so my response was more for if somebody is putting in a permanent parking lot, not so much one for the wrecking yards and the salvage trucks and
Okay.
that. But if somebody's proposing to put a parking lot downtown, which we've got a few that are parking lots that are dirt, and if that's what their intended purpose is going to be, that was my intent, was they need to be paved before we start using them.
Yeah, understood. So the only way they would be able to do that with these proposed changes is to get an exemption, a temporary exemption from the city council. So I guess then the question is, do we allow that? Do we allow them to get that temporary exemption from the city council?
And also, how long is temporary? I mean, you just,
Right.
one's been years already, not really temporary.
Yeah, and temporary could be weather, like you say, weather related, if it's middle of winter, but I think a temporary should be up until the weather permits such work to begin. But yeah, other than that, they just take forever, and then you've got nothing but a dust bowl every time that people use it. So.
Yeah. Any other comments, council, on this? Okay. I will make that change in the code then to basically say that temporary is when weather permits it to occur.
Sounds good.
Okay?
Hey, Rodney, this is Matt.
Yes.
I think similar to, what we have with maybe the CUPs or some of these where we grant these, there needs to be a time limit maybe set to it where they may be able to come in and reapply if they want to,
Okay.
but perhaps we set a time limit at the time that exemption is granted.
Yeah, good thought. So allow an extension application at least. Okay. All right. So the next question was, I'm sorry, I just put your last names there. I shouldn't have done that. Councilman Bruner, do HOAs trump May to September parking of RV in frontage? And yes, CCNRs can be more restrictive than city code, so they could limit when those RVs could be parked. So absolutely. Commissioner Garner had a question about why density is a good thing, especially as it relates to traffic. And we've talked a little bit about this from Doug. Doug, do you have anything else to add to this discussion?
Here we go. So, no, I think that that's our concern, is that we don't exacerbate the problem by. I think that the overall goal is to try and reduce the number of trips that are taken on the roadways, and anything that we can do to facilitate that is helpful, and that's what we're attempting to do in some of these changes. So I think that the bigger issue for us in the long-term planning side of things is how are these residential areas that really have very little commercial servicing them, how are we going to get commercial, or how are we going to reduce the number of trips required from those areas? In the same time, encourage people to go downtown where we want people to go. So that's a little bit of a balancing act. It's never going to be a perfect outcome, but I think that there are ways that we can do that through the long-term planning and then working, again, as you mentioned earlier, Rodney, with discussion with engineering and with developers about updating the comprehensive plan a little bit to address that issue. So.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I'd add to that is that our impact fees for new development are intended to maintain the existing city level of service standard that we've set. And so I think right now our roadways are, the standard we set, we're a level of service D. And so as new development comes in, regardless of whether it's dense or not, the intention is to get those funds that would help to mitigate that impact so that we at least maintain that level of service for our roadways. And I don't know if Daniel is online here, but if he has any input on that, I'd appreciate that as well.
Yeah, Rodney, that is correct. Those impact fees are looked at to maintain that level of service. If there are things that are not on the impact fee list, the traffic impact studies where required, if they identify things not on our impact fee list, and the impact fee list is really the current, the things that are growth related within that. For the city portion pays for the existing deficiency, the impact fee pays for the growth related.
Yeah.
We have the traffic impact studies when they're done. If there are things that the project specifically drops over that level of service D threshold, then that are not included in the impact fees as projects, then those projects are required to do those mitigations. One that hasn't come up before council yet, or planning and zoning, there will be a subdivision that we've looked at the TIS that they've supplied, and it looks like it'll probably be our first subdivision that will be required to install either a roundabout or a signal adjacent to them because they're dropping that level of service below D and is warranting that. And so those are the types of things that are put in place to help address keeping the system at the level of service that we've set.
Great, thank you. And so then the benefits of density are less distance traveled. Although we are adding traffic to the road, those impact fees and other tools are used to mitigate those concerns. And then the other benefits are your other services that you're providing, you're not going as far to provide those services. So for instance, police and fire, we're not spreading out, we're not taking up ag land and we're able to easily more easily service those areas when they get developed near the city or higher density. Whereas if you did the same type of, or the same number of dwelling units on the periphery of our community and you spread them out and they're not dense, then you're traveling farther to get to those locations. So there's more cost to do that. So there are benefits to density, and there are tools used to mitigate the concerns about traffic. Okay, next one was variances, and this is the last one we got from the videos. Variances, we had 3 people talk about Chapter 24 and agreed with the proposal to allow the planning director to grant limited variances under certain conditions for fence heights and accessory structure setbacks. We did have Commissioner Garner say that he believed all variances should be approved by City Council to protect staff from making policy decisions. We have proposed some changes in Chapter 24, and we'll get to that as we move through this presentation, that would allow a limited ability for planning staff to have authority, or planning director to have the authority to grant these limited variances. And we'll get to that and have a full discussion about that in just a little bit. So those are all the questions and comments that we got from the workshop and from the videos. And I just wanted to open it up for anything else that we didn't cover that perhaps you had some questions or comments on. And then we will go into the proposed changes in the additional proposed changes we've made to each of the chapters. Okay, seeing none, I'm assuming that means that we all watched the videos, we all agreed with most of the comments, and then everything that we're going to cover now are additional changes that we're making from the workshop, after the workshop and after those videos. Okay, so we'll start with Chapter 1. And we actually only have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different chapters that we've proposed additional changes to. So, and they're not the entire chapter. We're not going to go over that. We're just discussing those changes. So the first one is 10.1.12, or excuse me, 10.1.2.5, land uses, and 10.1.12, provisions applying to miscellaneous and temporary and transient uses. So we had a discussion in our workshop about the 180 days for temporary structures, and that it needed clarification. Does this mean that a temporary structure could be built or could be placed in a location and then for 180 days, then rest for 2 days, and then come back and put it back on 180 days? We added to the definition, the last part there, in a calendar year, to clarify that. So 180 days in a total in a calendar year. Just in the definition.
Clarification, this is Jeff. Clarification on that calendar year. Would that be 180 days consecutive, or could they be there every other month? Come back for a month at a time?
Good question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we could do either one. Any preference there?
Well, I think the preference would be consecutive. It'd be a little difficult to try to track 180 days if you can.
Yeah, good point.
If they could be there every other month. You know, and
Okay, yeah, really good point. So we'll clarify that.
But then we get into this. Sorry, Rodney, this is Brett. The only hard thing about that then is like we said before, you could be there for 170 days, take 2 days off, and then be there for another 180. So how do we?
But I think what we're saying is 180 days total in the year, and those 180 days should be consecutive, right?
yeah. So that they wouldn't be able to come back for 2 days, take 2 days off and then come back.
Yeah,
That wouldn't happen.
right.
Right,
Patrick?
okay.
Yeah, that's consistent with the building code. Building code is 108 consecutive days. Anything under that 180 days and less is considered a temporary structure. Anything over that is a permanent structure and requires full building permits. And so it should be consistent with that, I think.
Okay, thank you. All right, we had some discussion about food trucks. There was lots of discussion about food trucks, and we're recommending that we don't proceed with the changes that we'd recommended. We'll just continue to not enforce the food truck discussion. Temporary uses are so complex, and we're going to have a thorough discussion about how we define this and how do we proceed with enforcement, especially since we've allowed these things to occur for years and years. It's just a challenging situation, and we just don't feel like, we feel like that would hold up our process of adopting all these other code changes at this time. So we'll come back to the commission and council in future workshops and try to address that at that time.
Rodney?
Yes.
To that, this is Steve, to that question, do we have people complaining now that there's a food truck sitting out in front of their restaurant?
Anecdotally, once in a while, not very often.
But I mean, that's not really fair. If you establish a business and, you know, whatever, and you invested in it, and then somebody comes along with a food truck and they're trying to, you know.
And I have heard that, you know, I've heard, well, you know, this business down the road is competing with me, and I'm having to pay taxes, I'm having to improve the sidewalks and the parking lot, and they don't have to do any of that.
And that's a good valid point. Why does somebody get away scot-free, so to speak, and the other guy has to pay all the taxes?
Right. Yep. So you can see the challenges with addressing this, because that is a concern. It's a valid concern. On the other hand, they may act as kind of an incubator and help people transition. But if they're transitional, then why do they occur for long periods of time, 10 years or more? So these are the kinds of questions that we're going to have to address. And I just don't know that we're ready to do that at this point.
Getting a task force to look into
Yep,
what they're.
exactly. Yep, we could certainly do that. Okay. Another request was that we make affordable housing, change affordable housing to workforce housing to destigmatize the land use. And so in our definitions in the code, we had it listed as affordable housing. We've added, as you can see here, the original was just affordable housing. We added workforce housing to that so that we can refer to these and have a specific definition of workforce housing. Is this workforce housing? Well, then it needs to meet these conditions here. And the next comment was, we just added the definition because we refer to these all the time, apartments, and we didn't have a definition, so this clarified that. 5 or more dwelling units. We also added to single-family dwelling a definition of a tiny house as being less than, is 400 square feet or less in floor area, excluding the lofts. And the reason we're adding this, so we debated whether to even put this in here, because if somebody builds a home according to standards of the city and they make it 400 square feet, then we can't really regulate the size of a home. And so if somebody comes in, builds a stick-built home at 400 square feet, we struggled to say, do we have any right to tell them what the size of their house is? And fair housing would say probably not in most cases. And we got into a situation years ago with this where we were requiring that the CCNRs require a certain minimum house size, square footage. And fair housing said we can't do that because it goes against affordable housing principles. If you want to build a small home, you should be able to do that for less cost. But the challenge here is that a tiny house has different building standards. So we needed to put that in our definition, that if we call it a tiny house, and we allow this, if it's truly a tiny house, then it needs to meet the standards for tiny houses. And building's gonna follow up, building department's gonna follow up with adopting those standards. And I believe that those are in the International Building Code already. Is that correct, Patrick?
Rodney, yes, it is in the International Residential Code. However, the state of Idaho has not adopted the tiny house appendix, so it's up for each jurisdiction to figure out if they need to or not. So what we'll do on our code changes that we're doing to conform to these planning and zoning ordinance changes is we'll pick that up.
Thank you. Okay, so that was it for that section. We did have changes to our figures in chapter 1. We found that the figures in there were just so outdated, and they were not helpful. Nobody was referring to them. So these figures that were in your handout are to help us identify what is the frontage, what is the front setback, what is the side setback, what is the rear setback. All these conditions, we have different lots, shapes, and ways they're configured. In this situation, it's a flag lot, so they still have the access out to the roadway for this back property. And this private driveway would need to be a minimum of 12 feet, because we no longer require that 22 feet of frontage. So it could just be 12 feet. Because that's the legal width for access back to the property, especially for fire department. So that is the way that we're going to handle that now. That was, we looked at that pretty thoroughly. This is a different scenario where the back property lot is its own lot, but it uses a private access or easement through the 2 front lots in front of it. And it's just shared. And so what is the front setback? Where do we measure the side setback? That's what this diagram helps us determine. And then just different setbacks and related to placement of buildings and garages. In this scenario, we are proposing a 20-foot minimum setback from the alley. We have run into problems because it used to be that alleys were built right up to the property line, garages were built right up to the property line against these alleys. And those could continue as they are. But if someone is proposing a new garage, we are proposing that it needs to be 20-foot setback, because we're running into challenges where people are parking back there in the alleyway and sticking out into the alley. So, and they just don't have anywhere to place their car if that's what's happening, and if their garage is full. So we're ensuring that they have at least a place to park their vehicle. Okay, and I think that's it for chapter 1. Chapter 3. So I'm going to cover the first part of chapter 3, and then we're going to have Brianna Howe cover the last part, which is the land use table. This is probably the most critical component we're going to address today. In our workshop, we had comments about downtown and what land uses should be allowed in the downtown. So she's going to address all those changes that we are proposing. So the first one, market potential and interest for developing apartments in commercial zones has the potential to decrease the number of parcels available for commercial development. That's a concern for us. The proposed code would require that any building exceeding 30 feet in the BC, the community business, or the DV, downtown village zones, shall provide commercial land uses on the first floor facing the right-of-way. Multifamily in the BC zone would still be required to obtain a CUP for approval. So that's a significant change. We have had a lot of interest in using the BC zone to do multifamily development. And essentially what that's doing is it's eliminating the ability to have commercial in these areas, right, at least on that property. And it was designated for commercial. And a lot of times we're finding that it might fit really well because multifamily is a good, it has a large challenge to get approved near single-family residential. And so commercial around it doesn't seem to be a problem. So it does seem to fit, but we're using up the commercial land use and making it so that we don't have, especially in these locations where commercial zoning is out near residential and there's only a little bit of it in that residential area, then people don't have places to go to for groceries or gas or whatever it is. And so we're trying to encourage some commercial to still exist. So that's the condition here, that any building exceeding 30 feet in those two zones would be required to, that was multifamily in purpose, would be required to have commercial on the first floor. Okay. So then the next part here, any multifamily development will, with buildings exceeding 30 feet in height, shall provide these things. And this still falls under this category of the only place where 30 feet can be exceeded are within 300 feet of these roadways. So we were struggling with this because a whole bunch of multifamily developments have been trying to be approved recently. You've seen these. Commission has seen these mostly. And they're near residential, single-family homes. It just feels like it's very difficult to create compatibility. And part of that is because sometimes they're proposing 4-story buildings. You know, they're just not consistent with a single-story, single-family home next door. And so we're proposing that if a CUP is obtained in a BC zone, it needs to be near our major gateways into our community in order to exceed 30 feet. So that's what this proposes. And then number 2 there with the red arrow, this is for multifamily development in the DV and BC zones along major corridors, only where outside recreational facilities would not be feasible. So if you can't obtain the 5% open space that is typically required of residential developments, you would need to provide an indoor facility of some kind. And we reduced that to 3% of the building floor area. And you could have all kinds of things, gyms, a rec room, a pool, but that would be necessary. Any thoughts or questions on that one? I felt like that one might need some discussion.
Well, Rodney, this is Mayor Debbie. And, as you mentioned earlier, the building type that you're suggesting would be taxed at commercial. And so if we were to implement this, it would be very difficult with our state tax structure to get someone to actually make this pencil out. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just thinking about the timing, because that statute needs to change. Because if we're requiring something as a city, but it doesn't pencil out financially because of the taxing structure, state code, the state statute, I should say. It's just I'm just thinking about the actual outcome of this. Any thoughts? Am I missing something?
Yeah, really good points and good question. We originally put it as 5%. Doug Critchfield recommended to me, maybe we need to reduce this to 3% so that it's more feasible. But I don't know.
Rodney?
How are other communities doing it? I mean, there's the other developments in other communities seem to be making it work somehow with the current tax structure.
And
So,
go ahead,
Rodney,
Doug.
my understanding of that tax structure is that it's based on the building. So if the residential is located, say this is all in one parcel, and the residential is located in one building and commercial in another building, then the residential is taxed at the residential rate. I'm not an expert on tax code, but that was our understanding. And so if residential is provided in a separate structure, that a portion of that structure would need to be dedicated to recreational use in lieu of the 5% open space requirement that we have for other multifamily.
So when I read 1A.1, that any multifamily development with buildings exceeding 30 feet in height shall provide commercial on the first floor facing the right-of-way. So we're saying that any multifamily development is required to provide commercial on the first floor.
If they exceed 30 feet, yeah.
Right. So in other words, so within that corridor that you're referencing,
Correct.
is that only on, right, in the community business zoning of Caldwell Boulevard, Garrity, 12th Avenue, et cetera? That they're required, so any multifamily is required to put commercial on the first floor, which would push any multifamily in those corridors into commercial taxation rather than the way the current state statute is written. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
And currently that is not, this is totally new. Is that correct?
Well, correct, that we are proposing that change because of concerns about using up the commercial land use. So, yes, that part of it is new. We currently have multifamily developments going into the BC zone with CUPs, but this would change their tax structure, absolutely.
So, on this one, my thought is, and I like the idea, I'm not opposed to the idea, we might just want to circulate it, which I believe we will have time to do before this is adopted.
Yes.
Because one thing I was thinking about today is circulating, ensuring that now that these changes are in and we have the document where it is, I know that you have already done the outreach, right, to the developers and builders, et cetera. With this piece, it'll be interesting to hear if there are any concerns or thoughts on that. Right, yeah. Because what you don't want to do is stop, not have anyone say this just doesn't pencil out as a requirement. But I think that, and I don't remember who it was that asked the question, said they're doing it in other communities. How are they doing it? And is this code, did you research the language of this before inserting it to see if it, how it aligns with our surrounding community code?
No, we'll need to go do that, absolutely.
So I would probably not support an addition unless we have researched it and can do a comparison with our surrounding communities to see how their code reads before we actually adopt something totally new. I'd like to see the research on it.
Okay, that's really good feedback. We will review how other communities are doing that. I think some of the reason that it works in some other communities, for instance, in downtown Boise, you've got commercial on the bottom of these large buildings, and you've got residential above. And part of the reason it's successful, or part of the reason it pencils out, is because of the demand for those buildings and the value of those buildings in the downtown. And so you can require a higher premium rate because they're in that downtown core. Even though they're taxed at commercial, they pencil out for the developer, the property owner. So I think that that's part of it, but we will certainly look at how other communities are doing this and how that might work. One caveat we in A1 here, we did put this other option, because we were concerned about this too, and said alternatively, a standalone commercial office building with residential structures in the same complex may be placed on the property. So we're suggesting that if that's a concern about putting it on the first floor, then alternatively, let's have a commercial lot or a commercial building on that same development that makes up for that, right? It provides some commercial near the residences, but it's not necessarily in the same building. So those would be taxed differently.
And then Rodney, maybe just saw Beth just put a comment in, which I think is worthy of noting, if you can see her comment.
Let's see.
I was just stating that there are other major roadways, and as the city grows, those corridors may change, and that we may not want to limit the height to just 30 feet for anywhere except for those ones you identified. I mean, I'm thinking about even like Cherry Lane may become an appropriate location, or you may also have instances where it's a deep enough lot that you could have a 4 or 5 story apartment building kind of in the middle of it, but your more exterior portions of the real estate are shorter buildings, and it just might be better used to have those evaluated kind of through that CUP process and making those determinations for compatibility as opposed to a blanket height restriction.
Yeah. Okay.
Good comment.
And that's good feedback for us. We'll do some research on that and see if we can come up with an alternative there.
Steve, I have a quick question.
Yes.
It could be that I don't fully understand this, which is likely. So I'm thinking through like Pennywise, the old Pennywise in Caldwell, where Terry Riley did the clinic on the bottom floor, and then the upper stories are affordable housing for those 55 and older. How would something like that potentially fit with this?
And the commercial was on the bottom floor? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so they have clinic space on the bottom floor, and then there's stories of apartments, but they're affordable housing for seniors.
Yeah. Well,
and I know they don't have, there's not recreation space in there, but the whole goal of that was to get them downtown where it was walkable. And because they were on such a fixed income, closer to walkable spaces for what they need.
Right. Yeah, and absolutely great question, and that's why we wanted to highlight this one. If the surrounding area provides that walkability and that recreational area, how do we identify that in our code? That's the challenge here. And so we're proposing the 3%, but if it makes sense to not have that 3% and say something like basically say that it must be within a certain distance of other recreational areas, we could do something like that. It's just challenging to put that into code. And so I'd be interested to see, frankly, how that Pennywise building, how that's penciling out. Maybe we could talk to them and see how that worked for them to have the offices in the bottom and the residential on top. That's a great example of one that we could look at.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rodney. Great. Thank you for your answers and opportunity to discuss. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay. So then, as Beth noted, we had this section on B that just said if it's not within 300 feet of those roadways, they would be limited to 30 feet. And just so you know, this is the challenge we keep facing. Is we understand that in the future, our roadways may develop out, and there may be a demand to go higher than 30 feet in these other corridors. However, right now, we're seeing these projects come before the commission, and every neighbor around them, these single family developments, come out in opposition to it because it's higher than their property, that invades on their privacy. The scale of it is just so much bigger. So with those in mind, that's what this is intending to try to address. Like, at some point, we've got to say to developers, it doesn't make as much sense to go out near these single-family homes if they keep getting denied because everybody's opposed to it and it doesn't fit. It's not compatible with the surrounding area. And so that's what this is intended to do. Perhaps in the future, if there are other corridors that need to be added to this list, we would just go back in and do a zoning code amendment again. It's hard to anticipate everything in the future of how this city is going to develop out. So we'll do our research. We'll come back with how other communities are handling this before our Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing and present those findings at that point. But those are the challenges we're trying to address here. It's a difficult situation.
Rodney, this is Brett. Real quick, I just want to thank you for taking some time to look at this kind of stuff. Because you're right, in the planning and zoning meetings, we've been coming up against this a lot. And it's nice that you guys are looking at some direction to maybe curb some of those meetings that go till 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, listening to the same neighbors talking about it's 4 stories high. They're going to be looking down in my pool in my backyard. And I appreciate the fact that you guys are seriously looking at this and taking some direction in that way. So thank you.
Yeah. And then number 2, I forgot to address this. Number 2 just says that if it's above 65 feet, if it exceeds 65 feet in height, that a conditional use permit would be required from Nampa City Council. That's a new change, and I didn't get a chance to review the email from our city attorney, Todd Lakey. If he's on, I'd appreciate his feedback on this. We originally had proposed a development agreement, but I was just concerned our state code seems to imply that a development agreement can only be done at the time of rezone or zoning. Is Todd online?
I'm on, Rodney.
Can you give us any feedback on that? Is this the appropriate way to handle this conditional use permit?
That's, I think, the best way to do it. The code does talk about DAs being tied to rezoning. There's opportunities to do different types of agreements, but they absolutely have to be voluntary. Mm-hmm. And where we're looking at putting in as a requirement, I think if you're looking at buildings higher than 65 feet, CUP is the best way to do it and be able to impose conditions that are enforceable.
Okay, sounds good. And then the height of, or the densities associated with multifamily residential development in a BN zone are tied, we are proposing that they be tied to the RML zoning district densities. So you're limited on densities. And those densities right now, the maximum density is 29.82 dwelling units per acre, which is pretty significant still, but right now, there's no limitation to densities in a BC or BN zone. And so we're proposing we limit that at least to the RML zone standards. Okay, and then with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Bree, and she's going to address our land use table.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start with first saying that Rodney sent everyone two documents that are related to Chapter 3, the land use chart. The one being, we sent a clean copy of Chapter 3. So this can be kind of difficult to look at. So the clean copy we sent you is if you accepted and approved all the changes we're proposing. It's significantly shorter, and we'll get into that, which is good. And then we also sent a comparison that we made of retail and office uses, which I will talk about in just a second. These first changes are all to the DH zone, so the downtown historic zone. Beth was kind enough to go through all of the uses in the DH zone with the Downtown Business Association. And these were the changes they suggested and we have now are proposing. So the following uses are went from being conditional, so requiring a conditional use permit, to just no longer being permitted in the DH zone. I'm happy to read them all, or if any of these are concerning to anyone, please speak up and we can discuss them. But we'll stop right there for a second to give everyone a chance to take a look at them. So these are just no longer allowed in the downtown historic zone.
So did you go over all of these with Beth Einig in advance?
Yes, these were all of Beth's suggestions.
Okay, and I'm sorry, you probably said that and I just missed it.
No worries at all.
Thank you so much.
Mayor, this is the feedback. We had a meeting with invites to the downtown, the BID board, as well as the Main Street Economic Vitality Committee. So it was kind of a combination of those two organizations that provided this feedback.
And I so greatly appreciate you doing that because I think there's great value in that feedback. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, so those were all of the ones that were no longer permitted. We'll move on to, these are the uses that were permitted in the DH zone and now they will no longer be permitted. So all of these will no longer be permitted in the downtown historic zone. There's a few more right here as well.
So needless to say, the roller dome is grandfathered in?
It's downtown historic, not the whole downtown.
Is that not the historic district?
Yeah, I don't believe Beth made any proposed changes to the downtown village or downtown business, or if there were changes, it was specific land uses.
Okay, I just am not sure where that line is. So thank you.
And any of the existing businesses that are operating downtown today would not be impacted if their existing use became not permitted.
Thank you, Beth. So we'll move on. So these uses went from being permitted in the downtown historic zone to being conditional. So these uses will now require a CUP. And then this last one, a bed and breakfast went from being conditional to just being permitted in the downtown zone.
So I have a question about that one because this is the downtown historic zone. So because I'm thinking that downtown, the historic zone, doesn't that reach out? Does that reach out over here into residential areas?
Some, yes. I'm not sure exactly the exact.
Does go to 16th, and so yes, there are some still existing kind of older homes, that, especially along 15th and some on 14th, that could be potential conversions for bed and breakfast that would then be permitted under this proposed change.
Okay, so what about the west side of the boundary, the north-south? What I'm needing to picture right now where that zone is, because you've got this residential historic area, but this is just downtown, is that correct?
Right, so it's Front Street to 4th Street and 16th, I believe, to the alley, or to 10th.
To 10th, okay. Okay, perfect, thank you. That answers my question because Then what is this historic zone that's over this residential historic zone called? That
Behind
closer to
City
City
Hall there is the Old Nampa neighborhood, but it's just kind of a neighborhood designation. It's not a separate zoning designation.
Okay, thank you. That's what was catching me a little bit. Was thinking possibly it was. Okay. That's so helpful. Thank you.
So those changes that we just discussed are just to the DH zone, so just this area,
Thank you for showing that.
of course. And then moving on, for the land use zoo, we added a footnote that a zoo in the DH zone shall only be indoors and with a conditional use permit. Meat market, we added a footnote that a meat market that includes a kill floor is not permitted. So they cannot actually kill the animal on site.
So I have a question about, which is good, yeah. I have a question about, we would certainly be a draw. I tell you, we'd have some protesters. On the zoo, I know we've had some challenges on a quote zoo side within even city limits. And I just in my mind, I'm questioning why we would have a zoo, even as a conditional use permit in the downtown historic zone. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me why we would add a zoo.
I think the thought was that more smaller reptile type animals that you could go inside, or like a small aquarium. Boise had an indoor aquarium that was very small, that you could just go in and look at smaller.
But it wasn't in their downtown core area. And this is our downtown historic area. And Beth, is this something that everybody thought would be a good idea for downtown? To add a zoo?
Yeah, I was just going back to see if I had any more notes that I had taken during the meeting. And I think it was just in terms of having additional attraction activity generators. Obviously, it's not necessarily a targeted use, but that if it was a small type of facility that would perhaps bring additional people into the downtown. And that's why it had with the CUP component as well. I think if council and the commission were interested in seeing it eliminated, I don't know that would create any heartburn from the downtown.
Mayor, this is Adam. I just wanted to chime in on that one. So that's why we made it a conditional use. At that point, we can evaluate it at a different level to see if it really does fit down here.
So the one thing that I have learned, and I'd love for Todd to weigh in on this, the one thing that many times on conditional use permits, there really isn't a way to deny them. Compatibility possibly, but if compatibility were the reason for denying it, I mean, it shouldn't be there in the first place, because no matter where it goes, right? I can't think of where compatibility would be an official term. So I would love to hear from Todd Lakey. If we were to deny a conditional use permit for a zoo, what terms could we actually deny it on?
So, Mayor, it's just looking at the criteria in your ordinance, and not having it directly in front of me at the moment, but usually there is the compatibility criteria. A negative change to the essential character of the area, those kind of terminology. And the reason you have a conditional use permit is that certain uses have more impacts than others. And therefore, rather than just making it an allowed use, you can include conditions that help with that compatibility. If you get a particular request or application for a conditional use permit, and there just really isn't any conditions that you can impose that make it compatible, then that's your basis for denial. You just have to fit it under those criteria in your ordinance. but they're designed specifically for you to try to see if you can include conditions that enable it to be compatible. But sometimes it's just simply not the case in that particular location within that zone, based on existing uses that are already there. Happy to expound further or address any other specific aspects, Mayor, that you have.
Well, thank you. I would like to hear from other council members. I'm just curious if anybody else has a big question in their head about, is this really what we want downtown as a zoo? And then the ability to not move forward with it. But maybe I'm alone on that one, so I'll defer.
Mayor, this is Jean, and I agree with you. If we're really trying to do infill, I don't see how a zoo is really relevant in that type of environment. And I think you'd have to be really, really specific about what would constitute a zoo. They usually take up a lot of space. And I mean, I think of the zoo in Boise, but to me, it's very different than our downtown corridor right now. And to me, it seems like a stretch for how it would be compatible, but that's my opinion.
And this is Steve. My question was, what also is a zoo? I mean, if you had a viper pit, is that a zoo? You have 10 different species of snakes, or do you have to have different species altogether? What constitutes a zoo in the first place?
I can speak to that. This is Rodney. So we do have, we went through this when we had the alligator escape from that property off of South Side, I think it was. And so we have clearly identified what types of snakes and alligators or whatever are not permitted. That's all in our code and clearly defined. So
what is a zoo then? Not what is not permitted, but what is permitted? Can you have elephants?
Well, this is Jeff, and I'm just thinking about that reptile zoo that was going in there at Greenhurst Nursery and no longer is, apparently. But if there was a building like that that was located in downtown historic area that someone might want to turn into a reptile zoo, like the one going out that was out there, I mean, that could be a possibility in the future. So, I mean, that would be something that would be looked at as a conditional use, whether that's a good fit, if it's compatible with the neighborhood, if it adds to the ... everything else in that criteria.
So was this someplace else? I just find it random that we just decided to add a zoo to downtown. And are we moving it from somewhere? Or I'm just curious what the impetus was that we decided to add a zoo as a new use for downtown.
Mary, it was already allowed as a conditional use permit in the existing code. And so when we went through, we just took the existing code of all of the permitted and allowed use and conditional uses, and we just went through each one of those and discussed whether or not it was something we wanted to continue to allow or change. So it was already listed.
Thank you so much. That really helps me.
And the condition here that's changed is going to indoor only, correct, Beth?
Yes, that's correct. So it used to be just somebody could put up a zoo outside as normal, or but we wanted to make it specific that it would be interior to a building. So.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good catch. Thank you for catching it, and I think that's awesome. And I'm fine if the zoo in general is one of those you think, good grief. But if we have the opportunity, so this would go to planning and zoning as a CUP, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All righty.
Should we take bets how long before we have one of these come before us?
Take what?
Take bets as to how long it would take somebody to plan one of these.
Yeah, exactly. All righty. I don't have any further questions.
I guess Councilman Rodriguez had a comment.
Temporary zoo, yes. Permanent zoo, no. I don't believe it says temporary.
Are you there?
Yeah, we can
Yes.
hear you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm fine. No, I was kind of confused about this, and what I was thinking about is if you have a zoo for the weekend, like, well, whatever reason, but I think that'd be kind of cool. But a permanent one is kind of crazy. I don't really know why and what. Whose idea was this anyway? It was kind of, I'm a little confused about it as to why we even bringing it up.
Just address that. So this is Rodney. So again, this was a permitted, a conditionally used permit was required for someone to go put up zoo in the downtown. The downtown, I forget the names of Main Street Committee and BID, thank you, reviewed this and said, we should allow this, but only in indoor situations. So that's how we got here, is that they're proposing that change to make it only indoor.
I see. Yeah, okay, all right. I still not sure about that, but if the Downtown Association wants it, I guess I don't have a problem with it, but yeah, I don't know about that.
Mayor Rodney, this is Darrell. Just a comment on and I'm talking about, just a one day or whatever. There's no questions that these are popular. For several years, we've had a reptile kids thing at homecoming at NNU at our biology department, from pythons to whatever, and we get a huge turnout for kids and that come out and take a look at those things. And we're also considering, so I may ask a question. There is a gentleman, my associate's working on it. I believe he's out of Emmett. He's been on national TV and so on, where he actually comes out. If you remember the old Johnny Carson, most of you are not are yet too young to remember, but used to bring in people that would bring out animals and so on stage. And we're considering doing that here on campus during homecoming. So if there's any challenge or any type of permit, we would need for that. But my point is as far as a draw, yes. As far as a permanent zoo, I think I would question having something constant down there. But I agree with Beth that those type of things do bring families, kids, etc. I think the dinosaur thing that went on out at the Fort Idaho Center was very, very popular. So anytime you can drive people to downtown, I think that is a positive. Okay.
So this is Rodney again. It sounds like there's enough concern about this one that we'll just remove it as a use in the downtown and add it to a temporary use that someone would need to come in for a temporary event of some kind.
Rodney, this is Matt. Can you scroll up to those uses that were taken away with these proposed changes? Because I think I saw on there that there was an auditorium. Is that correct? So an auditorium was no longer permitted?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering why an auditorium would not be permitted, but we're having a conversation about a zoo. Because it seemed like an auditorium where performances were taking place would be a lot more compatible with downtown than a zoo would.
And Beth couldn't jump in here, but I think part of the issue here is that they were trying to prevent buildings from being empty a lot of the time. So an auditorium that has an event once a week or whatever, it looks empty. It doesn't draw people the rest of the week. And so they're trying to get uses that would have a draw throughout the week.
That's correct, Rodney. So we have a lot of event spaces and throughout the downtown. And so the committee felt like it is dark space especially during kind of the work day when you want to have more activity taking place. And so we didn't feel like there was a need for additional type of auditorium or event space. And that's why the group asked to have all of those types of uses be not permitted within that historic district.
So I have a quick question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, what would you consider like a concert hall or a concert venue? Because wouldn't that be kind of the same thing? But I mean, that seems like something that you get a lot of people coming to, thinking specifically like downtown, a lot of the concert spaces are downtown Boise. And so if we did that, then would that eliminate that possibility of having something like that downtown Nampa that would bring a lot of people down to the downtown corridor?
All I can say is that I think that the committee felt like we have enough of that type of space in the downtown, and that we didn't want to have more of a very finite amount of real estate tied up in that type of use, that it doesn't create enough activity on a really regular basis that would justify more of that type of square footage. I think you could, for instance, and Rodney can certainly chime in if my assumption's correct, but if you had the old Pix Theater be revitalized as a restaurant lounge concept that had a performance stage that also allowed for different types of performances to take place there, that would be allowed because you would have it as a restaurant as well, right? So if it's open regularly but also has space for those types of performances, I would assume, Rodney, that would fall under more of a restaurant use as opposed to an auditorium.
Yeah, that's correct.
But if the Pix Theater were renovated into a theater, would that be a disallowed use? Theaters aren't called out, so.
Don't remember what we had under theaters.
I was going to go to.
And then Christy Watkins actually had a comment that I thought was good. Or interesting, because I'm thinking the term event space, because we're saying an exhibition, but event space, Dr. Cammers would be considered event space, I would think, one's currently not exhibition halls. And do we have definitions to go with these terms? So it's permitted use in a downtown historic district right now.
The theater is permitted, yes.
Good, okay. So let's talk about the word event or event space, if we could. The terms that we have in here are auditorium and exhibition hall. But I don't think the two businesses that we were talking about that currently have event space would consider themselves an auditorium or an exhibition hall.
And I guess I'm not sure, but I think I would look at these as if they're solely if they're solely for an event. We do have some of those in the downtown where they just sit empty until an event occurs once every 2 weeks or something, or once a week. And if that's the case, I would look at that very differently than, like Beth described, a restaurant, or if you're showing movies on a regular basis, or something's happening regularly. I would assume that is not solely an event center.
But my point is that our current words that we're using here of auditorium or exhibition hall, neither of the spaces that we're talking about right now that you referenced would be considered an auditorium or an exhibition hall.
Right.
So we would not have prevented the very thing that we're talking about with our current code terms. So the question would be, what term do we need to put in there to disallow people to come in and take a current space and only use it for events?
Rodney, I was thinking you had a definition around one of those two things that specifically identified it as event space in your definitions.
In chapter 1.
Correct?
It might be. You'd have to look at chapter 1. Let me look that up.
I mean, we need to make sure we have that, whether, if we don't already, but some kind of definition. And I can't remember if it was meeting hall or, I just remember seeing a definition somewhere that tied one of those items to event spaces.
If I remember correctly, I think we originally were going to do a footnote of some sort for a meeting hall and these bigger types of uses to say they weren't allowed in the downtown historic zone, but then we decided to do this deeper dive of the entire zone, and I think that footnote might have got lost
You do have
in
a
these
footnote.
changes.
You actually do have a footnote. It says large event centers are not permitted in the DB or DH zones. Determination of large is at the discretion of the planning director or his or her designee.
Okay, so that still is in there. And that was a proposed change from the workshop.
So, well, Rod, this is Jeff. While Rodney's looking for this, question about a museum. Is a museum considered an exhibition hall? Or could it be?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think museum had its own use identified, yes. Museum or planetarium is its own.
Hey, Rodney, in the building code, most of these uses are called assembly uses. And then you could have, if you wanted to just say assembly uses and then tie into maybe you don't want assembly use over a certain occupancy or a certain square footage. And then you could say, non-restaurant or not, you could better clarify that. But that type of language then goes into the 5 assembly occupancies in the building code. Mm-hmm. And then if the goal is to cut down on the number of people in for these uses, then you could actually put a cap on the occupancy as well.
And I don't think the goal is the people, it's the amount of open space or the amount of space just sitting there empty for most of the week. So, yeah, they want frequent visits to these locations. And so that's difficult to define. But I suggest that we look at this. I think we've got a good idea of what the council and the commission are concerned about here. We'll take a look at this again and see if we can refine a definition of an event center or exhibition hall so that it's more clearly describing exactly that, what they're trying to avoid.
We'll move on then for now. So for the land use restaurant, we added in a footnote that a restaurant with a drive-in or drive-through is not permitted in the DH zone. So a regular restaurant, a walk-up or dine-in is fine, but no drive-ins or drive-throughs. And then these were specific. A lot of these came from, and here's this meeting hall and exhibition hall not permitted in the downtown zone. So we covered those. But condominium permitted in the DB zone, downtown business zone, manufactured and mobile home parks not permitted in the IP zone. And that change came from our workshop. Beth had pointed that out, that we didn't want to take up the industrial land use. And then we made RV or proposing RV parks to not be permitted in any zone. And then nursing home and assisted living permitted in these zones here. Homeless shelter now permitted in the hospital zone. Same with a transitional home will be conditional in the hospital zone. Community center not permitted in the downtown zone. So we tied in community center, meeting hall, exhibition hall as those larger event type centers.
Could I make a quick comment?
Of course.
Well, you're using downtown zone, but previously we were talking about the downtown historic zone. And so I think it's important that we use the exact terminology so that there's no confusion.
I agree.
So if we could just change that to make sure it's the downtown historic zone.
I do think for community center, meeting hall, exhibition hall, the downtown, it was all downtown zones.
Then let's reference all downtown zones. It just needs to be whatever.
Downtown zone.
Yeah, so even though it says any downtown zone, for me, just like you did the nursing home assisted living, if it's not permitted in any of the DV, DH, whatever, just put them all in there so there's no misunderstanding about it.
Yes, of course, we can make that change.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And then we put vape shop. It was originally lumped in with tobacco, but we put it on its own line in the chart. And it's permitted in the BC zone and then conditional in the GB1, GB2, IP, and IL zones. And then for bank, we separated this out into a bank with a drive-through and a bank without a drive-through. And this was due to concerns of having drive-throughs again in certain zones, specifically the downtown historic zone. And then we added taxi cab to this land use. So truck, taxi cab, and bus parking lot. So they were all together.
Can you explain what that means? When you add a taxi cab, I'm not seeing what the whole statement is. What is that saying that we can do?
Yeah, so a taxi cab was on an individual line, and all it said in the chart was taxi cab, and we thought the same thing. What does that mean? A taxi cab can be in a certain zone, so we added it to be in. We interpret it as a taxi cab, like terminal, if you will, like how buses have a place that they go park, and trucks have a place that they park overnight while they're in between runs. That's taxi cab is now added into that instead of just being on its own line.
But what land use is it? It says taxi cab was added to and I'm sorry, I maybe should know this, but it's not clear to me right now. Taxi cab was added to the following land use. So a land use is truck, taxi cab, and bus parking. But where is that land use allowed? Which zones or which not?
We can go to, let's see here. It is conditional in the BC, GB1, GB2, and permitted in the IP, IL, and IH zone.
Okay. Thank you. I just feel much more comfortable.
That should have been made more clear in this to begin with, so.
And you might update it so that if you could update this document, because like with Randy stepping off and Jean stepping off, we should send this document to them, but let's update this document to be clear in those areas that we've talked about before we send it out to them, if you could.
Yes, of course, we can make those changes. So moving on, so this is a pretty big change that we made from the workshop and also from the comments that Beth gave us, that there was a general thought that we should group retail uses together and also office uses together to condense our land use chart. So we don't have all of these items listed individually. They will now be, so what we decided on was that they will now be condensed into one of these three categories, either retail general, retail bulky, or construction showroom. And then really quickly, we'll come back to this list, but I'll show you the definition of those. So retail general, we defined as the structure or space has a building footprint less than or equal to 15,000 square feet. So this is some of those smaller tenant type spaces, and they're permitted in these zones listed here. Retail bulky was defined as the structure or space has a building footprint greater than 15,000 square feet. So that's more of those grocery type stores, like shopping centers, those type of uses. And they're allowed in BC, GB1, and GB2 zones, and conditional in the BN, DB, DV, DH, IP, and IL zones. And then we also did construction showroom and permitted in these zones, and then conditional in the DB and DV zones. So what we did here, and I think it would be helpful at this point to show you the comparison that we made. We did not group together these lightly. We individually looked at each retail use and looked at where it was permitted currently in our current code, and we made a comparison so that we could more accurately make a decision on where these should be allowed. And this right here is what we landed on as a team. So the retail general being allowed in these zones, and then retail bulky. So some of those larger land uses that may need a closer look, and hence the conditional use permit.
So a quick question, when you were choosing your terms for retail general, bulky, and construction showroom, do those mirror what other communities are using in their zoning language in our local Treasure Valley?
Yes, they do. And they also mirror our parking code. We use the same terms in our parking code. This is how we determine the number of parking spaces in our parking code right now, by it being a general or a bulky and by size. So it now reflects what our parking code already said.
That is awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Could it be possible for a hardware store to be retail general and not classified as bulky due to the size?
Yes, that's correct. So we would look at the size. So say it's a hardware store of over 15,000 square feet.
First, right?
It would, yes, and that would then be categorized as bulky. But if it's a hardware store like I feel like Ace Hardware typically could be smaller, something like that, that's under 15,000 square feet, then it would just be a general.
Okay.
So it would depend on the size. We can go back to, so these were all of the zones that we then eliminated from the land use chart and will now be condensed into one of these three uses and based on size. And we did the same exact thing with office uses. We just have one term, so office general. And these terms were removed from the table, and now they will now be condensed into this office general category. We made the same comparison with office here. We took them all, we looked at where they were all permitted or conditional, and made our decision based off of that. And then lastly, we added a footnote for commercial and non-commercial kennel license. It just says that a kennel license is required to operate a non-commercial kennel and is required to be renewed annually. This was already a requirement. We just put it in the footnote to draw attention to it and to also note that it has to be renewed annually. But that is something we already enforced. So that is the end of chapter 3. So chapter 7, there's only one change. This is also my chapter. We added more language for detached accessory structures. This was the original here. We just made it consistent with what is already in the RS chapter and the RD chapter. So all of the residential zones now have these same standards for detached accessory structures. And then chapter 24, I believe, is Rodney's. You want to just stay here?
Are you up next?
Me?
Oh, no, Doug is. I'll switch it.
Okay.
Okay, so we actually talked about this already in the opening comments, the general comments, and essentially we're proposing that a variance be allowed to be approved by the planning and zoning director and under these certain circumstances. So in the RS and RD zones, setbacks may be reduced to 3 feet for accessory structures where hardships exist, including topographical challenges, lot size, or confined building area. If a variance is granted, the structure shall be restricted with a reduced setback to a height of 12 feet. And that, I should have made this clear. This would not be for the front yard setback. It would be only for the side and rear setbacks.
So Rodney, would you add that language then to?
I sure will. Mm-hmm.
You will, okay.
Yeah, and it's actually in the code. I just forgot to put it into this document, so. 1024-2D2, fence heights up to 8 feet where topographical challenges exist. We have these all the time. The neighbor next door, their property raises in elevation greater than than the first property owner. And so in order to just provide some privacy, going up 2 extra feet is often what we get a request for variances. And that's the only changes I had for the variance code. The next,
Rodney, could I weigh in just on chapter 24 and what you were just talking
You
about
bet.
there? I'd just like to comment that, and I'd like to get the feel from council if they agree with this. I've talked to Rodney, and I have recommend the director to have some authority on some simple things. And as long as by policy it's clearly defined, I think my thought was it would save time coming to a public hearing for a variance when really it's a pretty simple variance and it doesn't need to take up time. And so I have supported this and recommended it. So I'm curious, is this okay with council?
Mayor, this is Victor Rodriguez, and I've been proponing this for a long time, so thank you. I like this idea. Go for it.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I'm not off base, but I just think if we can reduce the things that are having to come through an actual process when it's pretty simple, if we can grant permission for those decisions to be made, I appreciate it. Any other comments before we go on? Okay, Rodney, go for it.
Thank you. So the next section will be covered by Doug Critchfield.
Okay, Mayor, Council, Commission. So this is chapter 26. This is the Plan Unit Development Master Plan Communities chapter. So these are the additional changes. And Rodney's operating, or whoever's running the,
I think your mic's off.
Sorry, mic was off. I'm helping Rodney out, so I have control here.
Thanks. Okay, thanks, Bree. So just in the use requirements for PUDs, we decided to remove, the code says that 20% of the gross land area may be designated to other uses. We're looking for a little more definition in these plan unit developments. If it's a combined mixed use type of development, the RP zone, residential professional zone, will take care of most of that. And so we just figured that to create clarity when we receive a development, that this really wouldn't be a provision we wanted to have in that code. So, Ray, if we remove, go down to, if you could, so I put a red arrow next to the ones that I think are really significant code changes. So if you could scroll down to the next red arrow. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I had a discussion with Patrick about locating buildings, adjacency of buildings, and the fire code ratings and also ventilation issues. And we both agreed that 4 feet to the property line should be the minimum that we go on a setback in a plan unit development in a master plan community. If we go any closer than that, then it doesn't allow for much of an eave overhang. And really, if you have 1 foot or greater in your eave overhang, that allows for better ventilation. And if you come closer to each other, if you have 3 feet separation from the property line and you have an eave overhang into that setback, it requires that eave to be fire rated, and that could be not so desirable for a development. So we agreed to just keep it at a 4 foot setback with a 1 foot maximum eave encroachment into that setback. And that would keep the builder out of dealing with any of the fire code requirements for that adjacency. So if we scroll down a little bit, the next arrow talks about for PUDs, master plan communities, and subdivisions, we're going to be requiring a neighborhood meeting, that the developer go out to the neighborhood and meet with the residents and show the project, the logistics, and we've stated some requirements for that it needs to be held after work hours or during the weekend. and it needs to be advertised by the applicant and so forth. And the reason for this, again, is to try and alleviate some of the mass showings that we have at the council and commission meetings, and allow the developer to go out and explain it to the community and hopefully quell some of the concerns that people have. It will also provide more transparency in the process, and so this is something that Meridian requires. I don't know if Boise requires it, but I know Meridian requires this of every development, so it's not a new thing for most of the developers in the area. So I wanted to show that there as part of the PUD as well as the MPC process. Those were really the only changes that we're proposing to 26, the additional changes. If we go into 27, there's a neighborhood meeting required, so we'll pass that one. And then Bree, if you can go into the next one. Another thing that we're going to be asking a developer to do on a subdivision, any subdivision, is to provide an open space plan that really illustrates the area. It indicates the amount of open space that's going to be provided. It highlights that in a plan so that it's easily legible. And also, we're going to ask for cut sheets or manufacturer details or any architectural or structural engineering elevations of the recreational elements that they're going to be providing, or any furnishings or lighting, paving, things that make that space unique as a recreational element. So that also, again, is something that Meridian requires, and so we're mimicking that a little bit. So this cottage and cluster housing development, there's a lot of changes. I tinkered a lot with this one over the last few weeks, and did some research and started looking what other communities are doing. And so this whole section here is going to be changed. And if you scroll down to that the next red arrow there, right there. So a lot of this is just cleaning up the language, making it more clear, more in line with state law and codes requirements. And one of the things that we talked about earlier was to allow for tiny homes in these types of developments. And so this is what this refers to, is that they need to conform to the codes that will be utilized by the Nampa Building Department for tiny houses. So just wanted to point that out, that those will be allowed in a cluster and cottage development. And then the next red arrow is really a description of what a tiny house is. And that's repeating what's in the Chapter 1 definitions. If we go down a little bit further, so the floor area and building articulation. So there are minimum floor area and ceiling height requirements in the building code, and we really hadn't stated that in this code, particularly with cottage development, and now with tiny homes. There's different standards for ceiling heights and floor area requirements, and so we're just stating here that they need to follow the Nampa Building Department requirements as far as that's concerned. So that's just a little bit of a change to the code.
Hey, Doug, this is Mary, and I'm sorry, you maybe shared this. What areas in the cottage and cluster developments that you're talking about that tiny homes are allowed to be in? Mm-hmm. Just some clarification. A tiny home is allowed in all cottage and cluster development areas. Would that be a true statement?
Yes, it actually, per our code, and we had a conversation about this yesterday, per our code, a tiny home would be allowed to be built on any residential lot. So it's not just cottage developments. What differentiates the two is that a cottage development has a specific configuration around a central open space and separate parking. The parking doesn't have to be adjacent or near the unit. It's a separate parking area that services that cluster area. But in terms of a tiny home, that we're essentially allowing now a tiny home to be built on any residential lot.
And I think that I'm going to say I support affordable housing, but I question if that's a good idea. Because we do have a responsibility to protect our homeowner values somewhat. That's why we have zoning and code and zoning ordinances. If we allow a tiny home to come in any residential lot, I think that could really be problematic. And I don't know if that's what we've intended. I'd like to hear from everybody else to know what their thoughts are on this, because it's a pretty big decision for a community to say you can put a tiny home on any lot. So next to Carriage Hill, for example, where right now we have, and on Iowa and Middleton, I think it is, I can't remember, we've got a townhome subdivision that you've got with an annexation, and you've got a lot of people that don't like it. I think if I hear you correct, and maybe I'm misinterpreting something, you would be allowed to put a tiny home anywhere. Is that correct?
Yeah, the way that it's sitting now in the code, that would be the case.
Is that the way it is now, or is that how our language has adjusted to be?
That's the way it's adjusted.
Doug, may I jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead, Bonnie.
Mayor, the only thing that we're adjusting is the definition. So right now, a home could be built next to any large house development, and they could build it 400 square feet. I mean, that could be done. The standards are that we require it be on a foundation and according to our building standards. So there's really, right now, anybody could do that. What we're trying to do is just define this better. And then also, if anybody built to the different standards of an official tiny home, they would have to comply with the correct building standards for that type of development.
Okay. And then thank you for that clarity. Another question that I have is, when we look at the fiscal impact study of a tiny home subdivision, let's say, does that cover, does or will the tax revenue offset the cost of services? So go ahead.
Yeah, and that's something that we will have to evaluate for each project to determine that. I would say that if it's on a large lot and it's a tiny little home on a large lot, it's probably not going to do too well. And so each project, but if it's on a really small lot surrounding, as Doug has described, surrounding a common open landscape area, then yeah, that might come out to benefiting the city. But it just depends, and that's why we'll have to run that fiscal impact analysis.
Hey, Rodney?
Yes.
This is Matt. Is there a way that you could do, put a condition that any dwelling unit that was, less than 400 square feet, 400 square feet or less, that they would have to have a conditional use permit to place that, which would then give you the opportunity to have a better review of the circumstances surrounding where they want to put it?
So I'd look to Todd Lakey for that question. We are a little nervous about doing anything related to that because affordable housing and fair housing laws kind of restrict us a little bit, but I'd look to him for direction there.
So, Rodney and Matt, I think I'd need to look a little deeper into that, but my thinking was, what if we, instead of, treated it like has some kind of square footage limitation, which I think was the basis of the previous problems we've had, treat it more like a townhome or something that we know are typically, of a particular size, and make the zoning requirements for tiny homes similar to townhomes. But I worry a little bit as well about putting a square footage limit on it. So those are my thoughts.
You know, I think that the interesting thing about it is that I don't see that there would be a scenario where there would be a tiny home subdivision, right? I think the whole nature of the tiny home is its versatility, right? And so I think that what you'll find is that where people are going to want to put one of these things in their backyard where they have a little extra square footage there or something like that. And I think that being able to cater to those types of people is probably a good thing because it is going to use land that is probably underused right now, as opposed to putting it on, you know, bare ground that's never been used. And so finding a way to be able to allow people to put these things in, you know, non-traditional settings is probably where we need to find it.
And this is Mayor Debian, Matt and Todd, I greatly appreciate both of your comments. I will say that I've had discussions with people interested in doing tiny house subdivisions. There are some that have been done in other states, and I've heard the discussion around them. So we might want to, I think there is that possibility.
Yeah.
Tiny homes are a different product. They're not and Patrick, I don't want to get myself in trouble. You're the building official, but let me just read to you what the difference is. It's a short paragraph here. It says that the code for tiny houses relaxes various requirements in the body of the code as they apply to houses that are 400 square feet in area or less. Attention is specifically paid to features such as compact stairs, including stair handrails and headroom, ladders, reduced ceiling heights in lofts, and guard and emergency escape and rescue opening requirements at lofts. So they are a different product than your standard construction and